Now, the average area of forest disturbed annually, also really important, right? Because if, even though they were small openings, they were occurring at a really heavy pace across the landscape, well, that might be important. However, the average area of forest disturbed, the gaps created, right, annually, was on the order of 1%. I think the study actually said, the Fravor study, as I recall, said 0.7 to 1.3%. So basically then, about 1% of the forest was disturbed in some way. These are studies from across, in some of the studies were from across our region. Some were taken at the Penobscot Experimental Forest in Maine, which has had a history of forest experimentation now for 70 years. I believe it's one of the longest, if not the longest, running experiments in North America on forestry are done there. That doesn't necessarily completely apply to Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia is quite obviously different than most places in that we have a vast coastline. Very few of our sites are very far from the ocean, which brings wind and closer in salt and other issues. Soils here versus some other place in the Acadian forest, in some areas might be poorer. I'm not sure about that, but perhaps. In any case, the question about Nova Scotia and its particular natural disturbance regime is settled, but perhaps not 100% settled, I guess. Out of the work done in Maine, however, the operative quote, the most important thing was, if the goal is to emulate most northeastern natural disturbance regimes faithfully, then the majority of the landscape must be under some kind of continuous canopy, multi-age silviculture that maintains ecologically mature structures at a finely patterned scale. Well, what the heck does that mean? That really means that small gaps, a few trees out, keeping them to a relatively small size, and coming back to that parcel once in 100 years or so was going to manage faithfully what the conditions were in the pre-settlement forest, and was therefore likely to minimize the impacts on other values while we were extracting economic values from the forest. I hope that's clear. Okay, so that's the way to do it if we want to manage in a way that mimics natural disturbance patterns. But if we do that, is it economically viable? That's the other question, right? A really good paper by Saunders and others in 2013 found that, in fact, these natural disturbance-based silvicultural prescriptions or systems are capable of sustaining greater diversity in forest structure and composition, which basically means a more natural forest and therefore fewer impacts on other values, while producing volume yields and financial returns that are competitive with other kinds of silvicultural systems. So in fact, this stuff is economically viable and ecologically preferable. And I would say that it's also socially and recreationally and politically preferable as well. I think it's pretty clear. We don't have the extent of research on that question in Nova Scotia that perhaps some people think we should have. I'll just, as a side note, say that our organization has partnered with 10 other organizations that work with small landowners to suggest to the Forestry Innovation Transition Trust that we do a large-scale pilot of this question in Nova Scotia on small landowners' lands. And while we can't talk about that right now, we hope to be successful in persuading them to support such a long-term pilot soon. hopefully we want to answer that question definitively. We feel that the research does in fact do that, but we want to put it in Nova Scotia's setting and say, look, the experience and the research that we've had over many years in our province suggests that things aren't really that different here than they are anywhere else. So from my point of view, Emerson was mostly right. Sometimes money costs too much. And in the forest area, short-term thinking has left us with a forest that has fewer other values and has foreclosed or at least made far more difficult other opportunities, economic and otherwise, in our province for the forest. It's just, the solution is not an easy one, because in many cases, with laudable exceptions, in many cases, the capital of the forest has been depleted to such an extent that significant investment in terms of time and money and training and equipment and wise decisions is needed to restore woodlands to the capacity that they had before the start of the pulp era. And the first step, it seems to me, to getting toward a better place is to acknowledge that there is a biological limit to forest productivity and to begin to follow the path that Bill laid out in the Independent Review of Forest Practices. That's a really quick overview of a quite complicated subject, but I think it's well supported, and I'm delighted to take questions if you have them.